The next step is going to be to start to build the left rear part of the chassis. Primarily we're going to put the graphite frame part on and the bearing blocks. The one thing to note about the graphite parts is there's two of them. They're virtually identical. The difference is how the bearing is pressed in. This is a flanged bearing, so one side is wider than the other. Make sure you've got the side where the flange will be on the inside when the frame looks like this, because it's going to be mounted right here on the frame. And here you can see that frame plate installed on the landing gear / motor frame. Some things to note about the fasteners. The longest one, the 12mm one, goes in this corner. The 8mm ones go in these three positions, and the 10mm ones go through this brace and into the bearings. Now if you look on the other side, you can see the main shaft bearings. The top bearing is not directional on a rotational basis, but it is directional in terms of it's a double bearing and the protrusion needs to go down. As far as the bottom main bearing, you want it turned so that the bearing will would actually come out in this direction or towards the center. And if you look at the block itself, there's a wider side and a more narrow side. The more narrow side goes between these vertical braces. At this point, you don't want to tighten any of these bolts fully. When we get the frame put together, that's when we're going to tighten everything up so we've got the best alignment. Alright, we're going to assemble the main drive gear, or the constant drive, auto rotation hub, whatever you like to call it. This is the standard setup that comes in the V2 kit. It uses dual one-way bearings and a rather large aluminum hub. The tail rotor drive gear comes assembled as you see it with the hub on it. The second thing I want to show you is an optional auto hub. It's a sprag bearing, so named because it uses a sprag bearing as the primary way to drive the main gear. But let's start by putting together the standard gear, and then I'll show you the sprag setup. The standard auto hub, very easy to assemble. You want to take the center axle, you want to put some grease on it. Simply slide it into the one-way like this. Obviously it'll only turn in one direction because it's pre-made, it's turning in the correct direction. Take the main gear, it has a recess on what will be the back side of it, and there are beveled edges or recessed edges for the bolt side of it. That simply slips over this hub, and you're going to use the 3mm flatheads to put this together. Once you've got all 6 bolts in the main gear, you want to tighten these down with thread lock. You want to do it like you would a car tire, alternating across them so that you properly load the bearing. And then the tail rotor drive gear simply slips over this. Now this is going to go on the main shaft with a pin, so you're going to need to align the holes in the tail rotor drive hub with the holes in the axle, center axle, and then that's going to have to align with the main shaft. So that just slips over. This is ready to be put into the frame at this point. So now we're going to install the main drive into the frame assembly we put together a little earlier. The main shaft rotor head assembly that we put together first can be inserted through the top bearing block. You want it to go just about that far. First thing that's going to go on there is a thrust bearing. This is a standard thrust bearing. It's 2 races with a center ball race. As is typical, one hole is larger than the other in these outer races. Doesn't really matter here because of the way this is going to get loaded. You want to put some grease in this bearing, slip it over the main shaft like so. Next thing you're going to take is this retaining clamp. It has a ridge on it. That ridge goes up towards the thrust bearing. Now you want to take the main drive that we put together earlier. Drops in here. You can slide the main shaft like so. You don't want it to come all the way out the bottom because there's one more part that needs to go in here. That's this brass spacer, goes between the bottom of the auto rotation hub and this lower bearing. Once you get this spacer washer in place, you want to push the main shaft down until it's flush with the bottom of this lower main shaft bearing block. You want to rotate, you want to actually take a rod or a driver or something, insert it through the hole in the tail rotor drive. You may need to rotate this slightly to line the hub up, and you're going to need to turn the main shaft until you can slide this all the way through. That way you know everything's lined up, because the next thing you're going to need to do is push this pin into the tail rotor drive hub through all of these parts, and if you've got it lined up, it'll go right in. Once you get the pin in, you want to insert these two M3 set screws in each end of the upper tail rotor drive hub. Basically, you need to make them flush with the outer part of the hub. That'll center the pin. You want to put these in with thread lock. Don't over tighten these, you'll just distort the parts. Doesn't need to be tight, it just needs to be snug. Now, one thing I want to say about the pin assembly, there's a bunch of clearances, or there's a bunch of tolerances that are aligning here. There's a hole in the main shaft, there's a hole in the hub on the upper tail rotor drive gear, and there's a hole in the axle that goes in the middle of the auto rotation hub. All of those things have to line up to get the pin through, and the tolerance is fairly tight on the outer hub. So you may need to rotate all the parts a couple of times. You may need to try from one side or the other to get this to go through. If it will not go through under any circumstances, what's pretty typical is to drill the hole in the main shaft slightly, because usually it's too tight for all the parts to go through. Just check the tolerances and the alignment between all those parts, and try several combinations. I think you'll find it'll slip right through. Now I want to show you the optional sprag gear assembly. The parts are different. The main gear is different. This is a different part number. The recess on the bottom of it is a different size. It's actually larger. The center hub is also much smaller, has a steel ring inserted for the sprag to ride against. And this goes together by taking a little small O-ring spacer that goes in the bottom. You want to take the sprag bearing, and it has a number on it, which you might be able to see there. It has a 422 on the outer race of this. That actually has to go facing down into the hub. You drop it in, you take the remaining O-ring, it sits right on top of that, like so. There's a cover plate. It has a extended portion on it that actually goes down, capturing the bearing and the spacers, and there's 4 flathead bolts that hold this together. Okay, here you can see the hub assembled. I've got the back plate on it, it's tightened down. You can use thread lock on these, tighten them down good. You need to lubricate the sprag bearing, because once it's put together you really can't lubricate it easily without taking it back apart. You can use oil or grease. These days I'm using grease. Something like this Tri-Flow synthetic Teflon works well. And once you get the grease packed in there, you're going to take the hub, and you can see it's a much smaller hub than it goes in the standard one-way. I wanted to show you this center hub that goes into the auto rotation sprag bearing. This is a stepped assembly. This is the part that the sprag bearing actually rides on. It gets inserted this way. This goes into the lower bearing. Had an issue where this step right here was very sharp and flat, wouldn't fit into the bearing easily without an enormous amount of pressure, which actually distorted the bearing. So I took a grinder and put more of a bevel on this. I don't know if they would all require this or just the one I have. It's a very simple modification. It's a one-time thing. This part will probably never wear out or be damaged. So once you did it, you'd be finished with it. The result is it makes it very simple to push these two parts together now. So if you have a problem putting them together, take a look at that angle and make that modification if needed. Now from here, this simply goes into the main drive gear just like the other one. It is a unique gear. This recess is actually larger on this gear. It has a different part number, but it'll slide over like so, and then the flathead screws go in there. Once you have the flathead screws in place, those can go in with thread lock and you can fully tighten them. The upper tail rotor gear slides over it just like it did with the standard one-way. It's going to go into the model the same way with one difference. As you can see here, the hub on the sprag bearing is much shorter, so there's a spacer that takes up that space. Just a note about both of these assemblies, the sprag setup not only has a really powerfully holding bearing in it. Sprag bearings are really good for carrying a lot of load, but it weighs less. It weighs about a ½ an ounce less than this setup does. If you're into weight savings, you'll want to look at this bearing. And here's how it looks assembled. You can see the spacer here. There's a wider gap. The brass washer still goes at the bottom here. You've still got the thrust bearing and collar at the top. This collar we're going to leave loose for now until we get all the bearing blocks tight in the frame. That's when we'll tighten this up, which will be in a later step.